Victoria stood before the mirror in her chamber, watching the servant apply the ancient oils to her skin. The red color glowed against the pale surface of her body, and she did not feel anything about this ritual. She had done it 300 times before, and she would do it 300 times more. The oil smelled of crimson flowers and old blood, the scent that had become the smell of her entire life. Chamber was beautiful in the way that expensive cages are beautiful. The walls hung with dark velvet, the floor covered in stones that once belonged to a human temple from a world no longer remembered. The windows showed only darkness, because the vampire moon had no sun, no day, and no natural light. Everything about her existence was controlled, measured, and planned. The servant, a younger vampire named Helena, worked silently as she always did. Helena had been born into servitude just as Victoria had. She had no memory of anything beyond these walls, and this made her content. Victoria wondered sometimes if contentment came from lack of knowing, or if knowing made the heart grow heavy with impossible questions. Today was the eternal ceremony, the day when Victoria would renew her vow to the void creatures. This was the most important ritual of the year, the one where all the vampire elite gathered in the great hall to witness the bride speak her promise into the darkness. Victoria had prepared for this day since she was born. The vow was not something chosen. It was something inherited, something that defined her entire purpose. She looked at her reflection and saw a woman who had never truly lived. A woman made of tradition and fear and duty, dressed in the robes of nobility but hollow at the center. She had never questioned this before because questioning was not allowed. And she had been taught since childhood that the questions themselves were dangerous thoughts from her human side. The weak part of her that must be silenced. Victoria was half human once, taken from the human world when she was just a child. The vampires selected her for the bride ritual because humans had a certain quality that pure vampires lacked. Humans had something called passion, something called will, something called choice, and the void creatures demanded a bride who could bridge both worlds, who could understand both natures, and who could hold the two halves of herself in perfect, painful balance. The streets of the vampire colony were empty as Victoria walked through them. The vampire population lived in the underground caverns and the floating cities above the surface. But today they gathered in the great hall. Tonight they would watch their young bride perform the most sacred ritual. And tomorrow night would be like all the other nights, stretching into infinity. The great hall was carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Torches burned with blue flame, casting strange shadows on the walls. The vampire elite sat in ascending rows, with Lord Castellan at the highest point. He was ancient, beyond measure, older than Victoria by nearly 2,000 years. His eyes held the kind of darkness that comes from having seen too much and felt too little. Victoria walked to the altar in the center of the hall and knelt before the throne where Lord Castellan sat. The ritual words came to her without thought, burned into her memory since childhood. She spoke of duty, of honor, of the sacred bond between the vampire race and the great void, creatures who protected them from the chaos of the universe. She promised to sacrifice her own will, her own desires, her own self for the continuation of the vampire empire. As she spoke, Victoria heard something strange in her own voice, a question underneath the words, like a thin crack in perfect glass. She had never heard that before, and it frightened her. She pushed the feeling down and continued the vow, speaking louder, speaking with more conviction, trying to drown out that tiny voice that asked why. Why the ceremony ended as it always ended. Victoria rose from her knees and walked backward from the altar, never turning her face from Lord Castellan. The vampire elite applauded in their way, a sound like wind through empty caverns. Cold and without warmth, she had done what was required. She was still perfect. She was still the bride they needed back in her chamber. Victoria sat alone, and waited for sleep to come. But sleep did not come easily anymore. She found herself thinking about the world outside these walls. The human world she had been taken from as a child. She remembered sunlight. Though she was not sure if the memory was real or invented by her desperate mind, she remembered a mother's face. Though the details had faded like old paint, Lord Castellan had taught her that these memories were poison, that they belonged to her human weakness, that her human self was a burden she must carry like a stone in her chest. He had taught her that the only way to be happy was to stop wanting to be happy, to accept her role, to embrace the cage as if it were freedom. Victoria lay in darkness and wondered if this was all there was. If the next 300 years would be exactly like the last 300 years of ceremony and ritual, of serving creatures she had never understood, of existing without living. She did not know that everything was about to change. She did not know that fate was bringing something to the vampire moon that would shatter every certainty she held. She did not know that in the darkness above, a ship was falling, and on that ship were beings who believed in something different, something dangerous, something called choice. The alarms came in the middle of the night, and Victoria woke to the sound of ancient bells ringing through the caverns. Something had crossed into vampire territory, something that was not expected and not welcome. She could hear the sounds of soldiers being called to arms, the echo of running feet through the stone corridors. She left her chamber and found Helena in the passage, her young face pale with fear. "There is an intrusion," Helena said breathlessly. "A vessel has fallen from the sky above." Victoria had rarely heard the younger vampires speak with such excitement, as if the monotony of their existence had finally been broken by something interesting. Victoria followed the crowds to the upper chambers, where Lord Castellan stood watching. The containment fields were a damaged human ship had been brought. The vessel was small, barely functional, with scorch marks across its hull. 3 dozen humans stood inside the energy barrier, confused and afraid, looking at the vampire elite with the kind of hope that comes from having survived something terrible. The vampires studied the humans, like collectors studying rare specimens. The humans had technology, but it was crude compared to vampire science. They had weapons, but those weapons were useless against the power of ancient magic. They had courage, but courage meant nothing to beings who had forgotten what fear felt like. Among the humans was a man in uniform with gray beginning to show in his dark hair. His name was Captain Robert Hayes, and he stood differently than the others. He did not cower. He did not show terror. He looked directly at the vampires with an expression that was almost calm, as if he believed that somehow, against all logic, everything might be okay. "Foolish," one of the elder vampires whispered. "No," Lord Castellan said quietly, studying Robert with great interest. "This one is intelligent. He knows he cannot win. He knows he cannot escape. He knows he will die. And yet he does not break. I wonder what kind of creature chooses composure in the face of annihilation." The humans were separated and moved to different containment cells. Some would be studied. Some would be interrogated. Some would be executed. Victoria heard these decisions made as though they were discussing what to have for a meal, because to the vampires, these humans were less than nothing, less than interesting. But one human was chosen for the bride ritual, and Victoria felt her chest tighten when she learned this. His name was Kevin Murphy, and he was the communications officer of the ship. He had been badly injured during the crash. An infection had set into his wounds. The vampires knew he would not survive long, which meant he was perfect for the ritual, a sacrifice that would soon end itself. Requiring little effort from the bride, Victoria was summoned to the preparation chamber, where Kevin lay on a stone table. His skin was pale from blood loss, and his breathing was labored, but his eyes remained focused. He did not seem like other prey Victoria had known. His eyes held something that seemed like understanding rather than fear. As if he had accepted what was about to happen and had made peace with it. The ritual would be simple. He would be brought to the private chamber, and Victoria would feed as she always did. This was her purpose, her role, her function. She had never questioned it before, because questioning it was impossible. But as she looked at Kevin Murphy lying helpless before her, something inside her mind began to move in a way it never had before. Kevin seemed to sense her presence, even though she was still hidden. He turned his head toward the shadows where she stood watching. "I can feel you there," he said. His voice was weak but steady. "Is it time?" He asked the ritualist assigned to the ceremony, looked at Victoria, and nodded. Everything was prepared. She should emerge from the shadows now. She should complete her function. She should feed and return to her chamber, as she had done countless times before. But Victoria did not move. She continued to watch the human man who lay before her. And she noticed something impossible. His fear was not present. His face showed pain. Yes, but underneath the pain was something else. Something like forgiveness, something like acceptance, something like he had already decided that whatever happened next was acceptable to him because it was part of some larger plan he believed in. She had never seen this before in any sacrifice. She had fed on hundreds of humans, and they had all fought, all struggled, all screamed when they felt her power beginning to drain their life. She had been taught that this was natural, that this was the order of things, that humans were lesser beings who existed only to serve. But Kevin Murphy was not screaming. He was not fighting. He was simply waiting. "What are you thinking?" the ritualist demanded. "Can you not complete your purpose?" Victoria stepped forward into the light, and Kevin Murphy looked directly into her eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. Kevin seemed to see her not as a predator, but as something else. Something like another being trapped in an impossible situation. Something deserving of compassion. "My name is Kevin," he said quietly, as if they were meeting under normal circumstances. "My name is Kevin Murphy, and I am from a planet you have never heard of. It is called Earth, and it is a small world near a star called Sol." Victoria did not understand why he was telling her this. Why did it matter that he had a name? That he came from somewhere? That he had an existence beyond this moment? But somehow, his words changed something in the space between them. "If this is going to be the end," he continued, "then I want to know the name of the being who ends it. I want to look in your eyes and know that you see me. I want my last moment to be honest, not empty, not just a feeding for something that does not care." The ritualist made a sound of anger and disappeared to report this unprecedented violation of protocol. Victoria stood frozen between two worlds, her duty pulling her one direction, and something new, something unfamiliar, pulling her toward this strange human who believed that even in death, dignity and honesty mattered. "My name is Victoria," she said. And in saying her own name aloud to someone else, to someone about to die, she suddenly understood that she had never truly said her own name before. Not really, not to anyone who heard it. Kevin Murphy smiled despite his pain and his weakness. And in that moment, Victoria felt something break open inside her, something that had been locked shut since before she could remember. Victoria returned to the human section of the containment cells 3 nights after the ceremony was interrupted. The ritual was incomplete, and she had not fed. That made her unusual, somewhat weaker. But it also made her able to think more clearly about what had happened. She needed to understand why speaking her own name to a dying human had created such a profound rupture in her existence. Guards allowed her to pass without question. The vampire elite did not pay attention to the daily movements of the bride, and she used this invisibility to move through the detention areas until she found the cell where Kevin Murphy lay recovering. His wounds were being treated, which seemed unusual for a condemned sacrifice. But the vampires had other plans for him now. He was more interesting alive than dead, more valuable as a subject of study. Kevin looked up when she entered. and his face changed immediately. Recognition and something like joy passed across his features in a way that made Victoria understand that to him. Seeing her was genuinely important. You came back, he said. He tried to sit up, but was too weak. She moved to help him, a gesture that would have been impossible for her a week ago. I needed to know why. Victoria said it was a strange thing to say, and it revealed too much of her confusion, but the words had already left her mouth. Kevin looked at her for a long time before he answered. Because you are not what they have told you that you are, he finally said. Because you still have the capacity to choose. And that terrifies every power structure that has ever existed. I do not understand choice. Victoria said, I was born to serve. I was created for this purpose. My human side and my vampire side are chained together. And I'm meant to be the bridge they walk across. That is not choice. That is nature. Kevin reached out and took her hand, a gesture so shocking, so forbidden, that Victoria almost pulled away, but she did not. He held her hand gently, as if she were fragile despite her power. Tell me about your childhood, he said. Tell me about before you came here. Victoria wanted to refuse. She was not supposed to speak of such things. The memories were considered contamination. The human part of her was supposed to be buried and forgotten. But Kevin waited, and something in his expression made her believe that he genuinely wanted to know. She told him about her mother, a woman whose face was fading from memory, but whose voice still echoed sometimes. In her mind, she told him about running through forests and playing in streams and feeling the warmth of a sun. She told him about wanting things, about having desires and dreams, about believing that her life would be filled with choices and possibilities. Then one day the vampires came. She said, they took me because I was special, because I had potential, because I could be molded into something useful. They told me that my old life was less than nothing, that my human emotions were weaknesses to be trained out of me, that my only value was in service, and you believed them. Kevin said quietly, I had to believe them. Victoria said, because if I did not, the knowledge that I was stolen, that I was a prisoner, that every moment of my existence was a lie would have driven me mad. So I chose to accept it. I made myself believe that my cage was actually my home. Kevin closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, she saw tears there. That is not choice, he said. That is survival. But survival and choice are not the same thing. True choice means knowing what you want, knowing what you do not want, and having the freedom to decide. A door opened behind them, and another human entered, one Victoria had not seen before. He was older, with kind eyes and a small symbol on his clothing that she recognized from some ancient database as a symbol of human faith. Brother Daniel, Kevin said as the older man approached. I brought medicine, Brother Daniel said in a calm voice. Then he looked at Victoria with an expression that showed no fear, only kindness. You must be the one who saved Kevin's life. I did not complete the ritual, Victoria said, though she was not sure why she was explaining herself to this human prisoner. No, Brother Daniel said, you did something much more important. You recognized his value as a being, as a person, as someone worthy of dignity. That took courage. Brother Daniel sat down on the bed beside Kevin, moving carefully as if he did not want to startle Victoria. Then he looked directly at her and asked, are you happy? The question was so simple and so devastating that Victoria did not know how to answer. Are you content? He continued, knowing that every moment of your existence belongs to forces outside your control. Are you fulfilled? Serving beings who see you only as a tool, a bridge, a thing with no value beyond your function. I am doing what I was made to do, Victoria said. That is not what I asked, Brother Daniel said quietly. I asked if you were happy. Victoria opened her mouth and closed it again. The truthful answer was no. She was not happy. She had not been happy in 300 years. She had trained herself not to seek happiness because happiness was weakness. Why do you ask these questions? She said, when you are a prisoner and you will die because. Brother Daniel said, I believe that what happens in the next few moments of your life will determine not only your fate, but the fate of my entire species, and perhaps yours as well. You are standing at a threshold. You can return to your cage and tell yourself that this conversation never happened. Or you can choose something different. Kevin spoke then, his voice stronger than before. What humans know that your people seem to have forgotten is that you are not your role. You are not your function. You are a being with will, with mind, with the capacity to decide who you become. Every moment you accept the chains is a moment you choose to accept them. But you could choose differently. Does serving them give your life meaning? Brother Daniel asked, or does it just silence your screaming? The words hit Victoria like a stone striking water. Silence your screaming. That was exactly what her entire existence had been organized. Systematic silencing of every part of herself that wanted to rebel, that wanted to question, that wanted to live. She stood up and stepped back from Kevin and Brother Daniel. Because in that moment, 300 years of certainty cracked open like an egg. And she could not be near them without revealing how completely her foundations had shattered. What would happen if I chose differently? She asked. Brother Daniel smiled sadly and said, then everything would have to change. Victoria did not return to the rituals. The eternal ceremony came and went without the bride performing her vow. The entire vampire elite gathered. And she did not appear. The absence was impossible to ignore, impossible to excuse, impossible to hide. Lord Castellan summoned her to the Great Hall. And she went without resistance. She had passed the point of hiding or pretending. She had chosen her path. Though she did not yet understand where it would lead, her legs carried her down the corridors she had walked her entire life. But now they felt like foreign passages leading to a different future. The hall was filled with the vampire elite, and their faces showed shock and anger and confusion. The bride was supposed to be obedient, passive, accepting. She was not supposed to make choices. She was not supposed to rebel. Victoria stood before Lord Castellan's throne and did not kneel. You have refused your sacred duty, he said, his voice carrying power that had been accumulated over 2,000 years. Yes, Victoria said, you understand that this is treason. I understand that I am choosing to stop, she said, and I am choosing to understand what it means. Lord Castellan rose from his throne and descended toward her, his ancient eyes burning with something that might have been rage or might have been fear. You have been spoken to by the humans, he said. It was not a question. They have shown me that I have the capacity to choose. The elder vampire laughed, a sound like wind through graveyards. You believe you have choice, little girl, but you have never had choice. And you never will. I will show you why. He raised his hand and made a gesture. And the great hall changed. The walls became transparent, and Victoria saw through them to a space beneath the moon, a vast darkness where things moved. Things that were nothing like vampires or humans. Things that pulsed with hunger and malevolence and ancient intelligence. Those are the void creatures, Lord Castellan said. The beings we have served for 8,000 years, but they have not served us. They have enslaved us just as we have enslaved youth. Revelation struck Victoria with physical force. All her life she had believed that the void creatures were protectors, guides, superior beings worthy of worship. But as she looked at them, she understood that they were parasites, feeding on vampire essence, on vampire will, on vampire power. Lord Castellan continued, his voice now filled with something like sadness. I discovered this truth. Nearly 300 years ago, I understood that everything our people believed was false, but I also understood that the truth would destroy us. We depend on this system now. We are addicted to the structure of slavery. If I revealed this, our entire civilization would collapse. So I maintained the lie. I let the rituals continue. I kept the system intact, and you permitted this, Victoria said, her voice shaking with emotion. Because it gave you power he did not deny, ID could destroy you for what you are thinking. He said, but I am old and I am tired, and I am curious about what you will do, so I will give you a choice. Yes, a genuine choice, the thing your human friends have convinced you that you deserve. You can return to the rituals, you can accept the cage, you can know that you chose your prison, and perhaps that will make it easier to bear. Or you can refuse, and I will ensure that you are executed for treason. And your death will serve as an example to every other vampire who might consider following your path. Victoria looked at the elder vampire, and she felt something rise inside her, something that her human mother had called courage, and something that her vampire nature had been taught to suppress. There is a third choice, she said. Lord Castellan's expression shifted, and she realized that in his 2,000 years of existence, he had not imagined a third option. You can tell them, she said, gesturing toward the gathered vampire elite. You can speak the truth today, right now, to every vampire in this hall. You can reveal what the void creatures really are. You can show them that we have been deceived. You can offer them the choice that you have denied them for 300 years. He stared at her, as if she had spoken in a language he could not understand. The vampires in the hall were stirring, whispers moving through the ancient crowd. Some had heard her words, and the words were spreading like fire through dry wood. You asked me to destroy everything, Lord Castellan said. Ask you to free everyone. Victoria replied. The elder vampire's hand began to move toward his weapon, but before he could reach it, the containment cells failed. The humans, working with Kevin Murphy in the detention center, had somehow managed to disable the energy barriers and were now moving through the vampire colony. They were not warriors. They were explorers and scientists and engineers, and people who had been taught that freedom was worth fighting for. Captain Robert Hayes led them through the corridors, his weapon in hand, not to conquer, but to protect. His crew moved with discipline, and they were joined by younger vampires, vampires who had been listening to the rumors, vampires who had begun to wonder if their eternal service was truly necessary. The conflict that erupted in the Great Hall was nothing like the simple subjugation the vampires had always assumed would occur. The humans were outnumbered and outpowered, but they were not operating from fear. They were operating from purpose. They fought not to dominate but to survive, and their determination was fierce and clear. Victoria stood between the two worlds, literally and figuratively, and she made her choice. She reached out to the citizens, younger vampires, and called them to stand with the humans. She revealed the truth about the void creatures. She showed them the transparent walls where parasitic darkness fed on their culture. She asked them a simple question: will you choose to be free? Some vampires answered with swords drawn. Some chose to fight for the old ways, for the comfort of their chains. But many more chose to stand up and declare that they would no longer serve. The void creatures, sensing their power failing, tried to reach up through the caverns to attack directly, but without the willingness of the vampire population to feed them with ritual and obedience. Their power was diminishing rapidly. They had grown dependent on the structure of slavery, and when the structure collapsed, they became vulnerable. Victoria fought alongside humans who had accepted her, alongside vampires who had chosen freedom, and she felt something she had never known before. She felt the weight of her own will, the power of her own choices, the rightness of standing for something true. The void creatures were expelled from the vampire moon in the cycle of the third dawn. Lord Castellan chose exile rather than face judgment from those he had deceived for 3 centuries. He departed into the darkness beyond the moon, where he would spend whatever remained of his immortal life, knowing that his choice to maintain comfortable lives had nearly destroyed his entire civilization. Some vampires resisted the change and were given the choice to remain in the old ways, but confined to caverns separate from the growing free. Population Victoria had argued fiercely against execution or imprisonment of those who could not accept freedom she had learned from her human friends that forcing change through violence only created deeper wounds that would fester for generations. Instead, she argued for mercy for those who could not imagine a different life. The human ship, the one called Explorer 6, was repaired through the cooperation of vampires and humans working together. For the first time in history, Kevin Murphy recovered fully from his wounds, and he spent his recovery time teaching vampires about human philosophy, about human concepts of individual worth and collective purpose. Brother Daniel conducted prayers in the Great Hall with both humans and vampires in attendance. Captain Robert Hayes worked with the new Vampire Council to establish trade relations and cultural exchange. Victoria discovered that she had a gift for translation, not just of language, but of understanding how two very different species could find common ground. She moved between the human quarters and the vampire caverns, helping each side understand the other. 2 months after the exile of the void creatures, Victoria stood on the observation platform at the highest point of the moon. She looked down at the human ship being prepared for departure. It would return to human space carrying stories of unexpected alliance, of a species that had chosen freedom over the comfort of lies, of the power of individual choice to change entire civilizations. Kevin Murphy approached her as she stood, watching the stars, a thing he did often. Now she had learned that humans valued companionship and conversation. "Are you sad?" he asked. That we are leaving. Victoria considered this question carefully. She had learned that humans valued honest answers. "I am sad that you are leaving," she said, "but I am not sad about what is happening." One spent 300 years in a place where sadness and joy were equally forbidden. I had trained myself to feel nothing and call it peace. Now I feel many things, and it is painful, but also beautiful. Kevin smiled. "Do you know what the humans believe about moments like this?" he asked. "What do they believe? That every goodbye contains the possibility of a new beginning, that endings are necessary for growth, that mortality, even for beings like you who will live for thousands of years, gives meaning to every moment." Victoria looked at Kevin Murphy, this human who had crashed into her life like a meteor and had shattered her entire world with nothing but words. "I've decided to leave with you," Victoria said. "I will travel to your world and see your son and understand what I was taken from. But I will also return to my people and help them build a society where choice is valued above duty, where individual will is sacred, where no one is ever imprisoned in a cage of tradition and called at honor." Kevin looked surprised. "Are you certain?" "This is a tremendous change," Victoria said. "I have spent 300 years being certain about things that were lies. I am learning that being uncertain, being willing to question, being open to change, these are signs of an evolving mind." Not a week one. That night there was a celebration in the Great Hall. Humans and vampires gathered together, some dancing in human styles and some performing the ancient vampire rituals of movement and light. It was clumsy and imperfect. The two cultures did not yet move in harmony, but the effort itself was revolutionary. Brother Daniel spoke about redemption and new beginnings. Captain Robert Hayes shared human songs about freedom and choice. Lord Castellan's empty throne sat vacant in the hall, a visible reminder of how far they had come. Victoria prepared for the journey to the human ship. She packed only the things she had chosen for herself, not the things the ritual demanded. She wore clothing she selected, not robes prescribed by tradition. She walked through the caverns that had been her entire world and felt no sadness, only readiness at the ship. Kevin and Brother Daniel and Captain Robert Hayes stood waiting along with the crew. They had accepted her fully, not as a curiosity or an exotic being, but as a person who deserved the same respect they showed each other. The ship rose from the surface of the moon, and Victoria stood at the window, watching her old home receding behind her. She felt the moment of separation like a small death, like leaving behind a self that she could never fully return to. But as the ship entered hyperspace and the moon disappeared from view, she felt something else. She felt possibility. She felt hope. She felt the beginning of something that had no name because nothing like it had ever happened to her before. She felt freedom. 300 years of her life had been lived as a bride, a tool, a bridge between worlds built for the convenience of others. The next 300 years would be different. They would be lived as Victoria, a being capable of choice, of growth, of becoming more than what others had designed her to be. Brother Daniel found her at the window and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You are not sad now, no?" Victoria said, looking at the vast darkness of space, filled with infinite light. "I'm not sad at all. I'm beginning." Kevin Murphy appeared with a cup of human tea, a beverage that Victoria was learning to enjoy in her own way. He had taught her that humans believed in small rituals of their own, rituals born from choice and pleasure rather than duty and fear. "To new beginning," he said, raising his cup to choice. Victoria said, raising her cup in return, "And to those who had the courage to show me that I possessed it all along." The ship moved through the darkness toward a distant sun, and inside it, a former bride and her human friends planned a future that neither vampires nor humans had ever imagined possible. A future where different species could work together, not through force or fear, but through mutual respect and genuine choice. A future where freedom was not a privilege, but a birthright. A future where one small being had decided to ask the question why and had changed everything.